So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we'll take a look at the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s were a time of great social and economic change. The culture of the 20s has been immortalized in F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel, The Great Gatsby. But while flappers, speakeasies, and jazz music were indeed a major part of American identity in the 20s, the decade featured so much more. The rise of mass media produced the country's first national celebrities. Widespread paranoia led to unthinkable violations of civil liberties, and the Klan returned. We'll survey it all in today's lecture, but first, a big question. Was the 1920s a decade of modernism or traditionalism? The 1920s presents us with a fascinating values conflict, a collision of two incompatible worldviews. On one hand, the country was embracing change. Gender roles were evolving, the middle class was emerging, and technology was changing the face of day-to-day life. On the other hand, politicians returned to the laissez-faire models of old. A generation railed against new fashion and music, and white supremacy continued to characterize race relations. So which theme prevailed in this collision? Modernism or traditionalism? Let's take a look at the evidence, then you decide. Our first big idea deals with the economy of the 1920s. The United States economy of the 1920s underwent significant growth thanks to post-war industry, an emerging middle class, and a culture of consumerism. During World War I, the United States economy was dedicated to the war effort. Factories were instructed to produce weapons and munitions in vast quantities. But when the war ended, the demand for these products vanished, and U.S. manufacturers had to reconvert their operations for the production of consumer goods, items like toasters, vacuums, and automobiles. Fortunately, the American people valued these products. The 1920s was dominated by consumerism, the preoccupation of society with the acquisition of consumer goods. Americans fell in love with material things, especially luxury items and appliances. And since people had been encouraged to save money and conserve resources during the war, there was incredible pent-up demand ready to be unleashed in the 1920s. Indeed, throughout the decade, the American economy was driven by the production and sale of these consumer goods. As a result, the 1920s witnessed the rise of white-collar jobs in sales and marketing. These jobs were part of a growing middle class, a socioeconomic group that wasn't wealthy but still lived stable and comfortable lives. The disposable income of the middle class allowed for the continued growth of consumer markets. It also supported leisure industries, including restaurants, clubs, and athletic facilities. The standard of living for the middle class was further bolstered by changes in the mechanics of commerce. Americans' purchasing power was enhanced with credit and installment agreements, which allowed people to buy now and pay later. This practice helped to jumpstart the automobile industry, which replaced railroads as the single most important driver of economic growth. Now, while things were indeed booming in the American city, the economy was not perfect. Racial minorities were largely excluded from this new middle class. Farmers struggled as the global food supply recovered after the war and wartime government protections disappeared. The working class endured mixed results. The practice of welfare capitalism did lead to slightly better wages and conditions for factory workers, but it was designed to undermine the influence of labor unions, and it did. While organized labor had enjoyed the support of the government during the Progressive Era and the war, a string of Republican presidents in the 20s reverted to the laissez-faire policies of old, withdrawing their support for unions and workers. Still, historians generally assess the 20s as a period of prosperity in the United States, and that prosperity fueled a changing culture. This is our second big idea. The 1920s witnessed significant changes in gender roles, an evolution in morals, and the rise of mass culture. The iconic image of the flapper was indeed ubiquitous in 1920s popular culture. But the bobbed hair and short dresses were more than just a fashion statement. They represented a shift in gender expectations in America. The new woman of the 1920s broke from her predecessors in a variety of ways. First and foremost, she was empowered with the vote, which forced elected officials to pay attention to her for the first time. She was also more independent. Young, unmarried women found new opportunities in the labor force. Traditionally female-dominated jobs in teaching and nursing remained, but new white-collar clerical and secretarial jobs were open to them as well. Women had more access to education, both at primary and secondary levels. Divorce laws eased, and the divorce rate increased, leading to greater independence for women on the whole. The 20s also saw changes in social behavior for women and men. Despite the fact that alcohol was prohibited by constitutional amendment, its consumption skyrocketed. Private jazz clubs called speakeasies thrived, and entire criminal empires were built around the demand for alcohol that they created. Attitudes about sex changed as well. Popular dances in 1920s clubs like the Foxtrot and the Charleston were seen as more promiscuous, and premarital sex increased significantly as cultural norms and taboos were challenged. Contraceptive birth control was illegal in most states, but advocates like Margaret Sanger helped to normalize and increase their use. And of course, there was the fashion. Young women rejected the long hair and modest dress of their parents' generation. But these choices were more than just a rebuff of dated trends. They were symbolic of a perceived liberation of the entire gender. Opera singer Mary Garden explains, "Bobbed hair is a state of mind and not merely a new manner of dressing my head. It typifies growth, alertness, up-to-dateness, and is part of the expression of the élan vital. It is not just a fad of the moment. I consider getting rid of our long hair one of the many little shackles that women have cast aside in their passage to freedom." The spread of this mentality across the country was no accident either. The rise of new entertainment media like radio and movies reinforced popular culture across the country. The 1920s witnessed the first American celebrities, outside of politics that is. Movie stars like Al Jolson, musicians like Billie Holiday, and professional athletes like Babe Ruth gained national fame and notoriety thanks to these new forms of mass media. But while America featured a shiny new modern culture in the 20s, it wasn't inclusive of everyone. Immigrants were victimized by increased nativism and discrimination during the 20s, and faced new threats from the government as well. This is our third big idea. The Red Scare of the 1920s grew out of increasing paranoia over radical political ideology. It resulted in greater suspicion of immigrants and threats to their civil liberties. Americans largely favored a return to isolationism at the conclusion of World War I, but they did not turn a blind eye to events taking place around the world. Of significant interest to many Americans was the Russian Revolution, which had begun unfolding in 1917 and which installed a communist dictatorship in the country by 1923. The radical and revolutionary nature of communism and a rise in other radical political ideologies worldwide unnerved many Americans and caused the first Red Scare, a wave of paranoia and fear that the United States might fall to a radical revolution. The Red Scare had a significant effect on American attitudes towards immigrants. Remember, the new immigrants of the late 1800s and early 1900s came primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were culturally and linguistically diverse, and certainly different from the largely Protestant, largely English-speaking native-born population. The hysteria of the Red Scare intensified suspicion of immigrants, especially because many were coming from Russia and its neighbors, the cradle of communist activity. The Red Scare also affected government policy. When a series of anarchist bombings in 1919 put Americans on edge, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a series of raids against people he suspected had anarchist socialist, or communist ties. The problem was, most of these raids were unwarranted, and many of the 6,000 arrests made during the process were based on little evidence. More than 500 immigrants were deported from the United States on suspicion alone. Of course, these raids and deportations were gross violations of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, and the concern over civil liberties ultimately led to their end. But that they took place reveals the level of hysteria surrounding radical ideology at the beginning of the decade. And the extent of American paranoia during the Red Scare is perhaps best exemplified with the trial of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants who were arrested in connection with a Massachusetts double murder in 1920. Their 1921 trial featured conflicting evidence, unreliable eyewitness testimony, and a prejudicial statement by the jury foreman. However, in the course of the trial, it was revealed that Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists. Despite the fact that the evidence against them was shaky at best, the jury rendered a guilty verdict. Both men were later executed. Now, we don't know for sure if Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty of the crime, and they may well have done it, but historians generally agree that their conviction was the result of the anti-radical, anti-immigrant bias that typified the Red Scare. Beyond political ideology, the 1920s was also a pivotal decade for race relations. Our fourth big idea explains. In the aftermath of the Great Migration, northern urban centers witnessed a flourishing of Black culture known as the Harlem Renaissance. However, as Black nationalism rose, so did white supremacy, and the Ku Klux Klan underwent a significant resurgence. You'll remember that during World War I, over 1 million African Americans fled the Jim Crow South in search of economic opportunity in northern cities. This Great Migration had an enormous effect on Black culture in the United States. The movement into urban centers created robust African American neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods witnessed an explosion of Black culture, known as the Harlem Renaissance. Named for the New York City borough in which it began, the Harlem Renaissance was a genre of art, music, and literature that gained notoriety in the Black community, but also pervaded mainstream white culture as well. The movement emphasized Black pride and history. Authors and poets like Langston Hughes highlighted the African American experience. They invoked the bitter memories of slavery, the unjust realities of Jim Crow, and the unfettered hope for freedom and equality yet unachieved. Musicians of the Harlem Renaissance pioneered jazz music, which began in the African American communities of New Orleans and traveled north during the migration. Jazz traces African rhythmic roots and became as much a medium for free expression as it was entertainment. Musicians like Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, and Louis Armstrong packed jazz clubs. They were celebrated by Black and white people alike. The Harlem Renaissance also featured an intellectual arm. W.E.B. Du Bois was foremost among Black thinkers and strategists and was a relentless advocate for equality in society. Others, like Jamaican immigrant Marcus Garvey, embraced Black nationalism. Garvey favored the empowerment of Black Americans through separation. He envisioned autonomous Black communities, unencumbered by white restrictions and oppression. While they disagreed on method, both Du Bois and Garvey had long-lasting impacts. Martin Luther King Jr. built his movement on the activism of W.E.B. Du Bois, while Malcolm X embraced Garvey's vision for Black nationalism and autonomy. But despite the elevation of Black artists, authors, and activists in the Harlem Renaissance, white supremacy continued to threaten African Americans' security, equality, and prosperity. In the North, African Americans faced harsh discrimination. Many Black people who managed to find factory jobs during the war lost them when white soldiers returned to the States. Blacks were largely frozen out of the new middle class, and lynchings continued in the Jim Crow South. Even in places where African Americans found success, their lives and property were under constant threat. During the early 1900s, Tulsa's Greenwood District grew into one of the most vibrant African American neighborhoods in the country. Black-owned businesses flourished there, so much so that the area was dubbed Black Wall Street. But in 1921, racial tensions in the city were heightened when rumors circulated about the lynching of a black Greenwood shoeshiner. Members of the black community gathered around the courthouse, but things turned violent. Tulsa city government officials coordinated with white rioters who tore through the Greenwood District, attacking residents and destroying property. Explosives were dropped from private airplanes and fires were set on the ground. Adjusted for inflation, the bombings caused over $30 million in damage, and the death toll is believed to be in the hundreds. To add insult to injury after the attack, white officials went to work obstructing Greenwood's rebuilding efforts. The area was largely rezoned, preventing African Americans from rebuilding there and forcing them towards Tulsa's outskirts. And while the Tulsa Greenwood massacre is believed to be one of the worst instances of racial violence in American history, it was not the only coordinated effort against African Americans. During the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan witnessed a massive resurgence. The hate-based group had been largely defunct since the 1870s, but in 1915, an influential feature film helped to inspire its resurrection. The movie, entitled The Birth of a Nation, was at the time a cinematic marvel. It was the longest and most complex film ever released. But the movie portrayed African Americans as unintelligent and sexually aggressive towards white women. And it depicted the Ku Klux Klan as a heroic organization, acting in the protection of true American values. The movie was widely viewed, and it was even screened in the White House for President Wilson. The perversion of history that was Birth of a Nation resonated with Protestant white supremacists across the country. The founders of the Second KKK embraced the interpretation and built the new organization around this romanticized memory of its predecessor. The Second Klan also widened the scope of its activities and objectives. You'll remember that the KKK of Reconstruction was an underground organization dedicated to the disenfranchisement of African Americans through violence and intimidation. While some of these tactics lived on in the Second Klan, the new Klan was more organized, more tactful, and more public. The Klan was officially recognized as a nonprofit organization. It was a powerful fundraising machine and a political action group. It had membership in the South, of course, but also in northern states like Indiana, Oregon, Ohio, Kansas, and more. By 1925, the Klan claimed national membership in excess of 5 million. The Klan grew its ranks through active public relations campaigns. They organized charity drives, donated to schools and churches, and threw Christmas parties for orphans, all while advancing their incendiary agenda. The Second Klan was politically active. It infiltrated government at all levels. In many southern states, winning an election was nearly impossible without the Klan's endorsement. And Klan members occupied high government offices too. The governors of Indiana and Georgia were both Klansmen. So were a number of U.S. senators and representatives. The peak of Klan activity may well have come in August 1925, when more than 50,000 Klansmen paraded through Washington, D.C., hoods on, but faces exposed. The Klan and the backwards ideas it espoused were pervasive in 1920s American society. Owing to the Klan's mainstream appeal was their adoption of a broader policy agenda. Beyond African Americans, the Klan of the 1920s opposed immigrants, Jews, Catholics, and anyone else they perceived to be a threat to white Protestant tradition in the United States. Indeed, nativism was a focal point of the new Klan, and in 1924 they championed legislation that sharply limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, predominantly Catholic and Jewish regions. They, along with other white supremacists, also supported the theory of eugenics, a race-based pseudoscience that was pioneered in America and later praised and adopted by Adolf Hitler. So much of the progress that racial minorities made in the 1920s was counterbalanced, if not altogether negated, by conservative elements that pushed back. a similar struggle emerged in religious circles. This is our final big idea. American Christianity faced an identity crisis in the 1920s. A modernist wing attempted to adapt theology to the changing culture, while a fundamentalist movement attempted to preserve traditional beliefs. The consumerism of the 1920s, along with the rapidly changing social norms, led to new questions about the role of religion in society. Church attendance was decidedly down among young people in America. While some members of the clergy saw this trend as the corruption of American morals, others believed that the church had simply failed to keep up with the times. A number of attempts were made to modernize Christianity in order to appeal more directly to the average 1920s American. The most famous of these efforts was a book by Bruce Barton entitled The Man Nobody Knows. Barton argued that Jesus was akin to a salesman, the founder of modern business. By relaying the story of the Bible in a way that the average middle-class American could relate to, Barton was able to reach a new audience and spark greater interest in Christianity. The book remains one of the best sellers of the 20th century. But not everyone took to Barton's interpretation. It was ridiculed in some mainstream circles, and in more conservative regions, it was considered outright heresy. The 1920s witnessed a rise in religious fundamentalism, especially in the rural South. Fundamentalists believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible and rejected any supposition that contradicted that text. During the 20s, fundamentalists took particular issue with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which contradicted the doctrine of divine creation and also challenged the biblical timeline of the planet. In 1925, fundamentalists in the Tennessee legislature passed a new law called the Butler Act, which prohibited public educators from teaching evolution or any other scientific theory that denied biblical creationism. The law was challenged in front of a national audience in July 1925 when a high school teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, named John Scopes, was arrested under its provisions. The Scopes trial garnered national attention, and it was less a criminal proceeding than it was an opportunity for the friends and opponents of science and religion to debate the merits of each in the national newspapers and on live radio. Scopes' conviction was ultimately thrown out on a technicality, but the Scopes trial, or the Scopes monkey trial as it was dubbed by the Baltimore Sun, put the values conflict of the 1920s on full display. So, which was the dominant theme of the 20s? Modernism or traditionalism? On one hand, the advances in household technology and post-war economic growth brought new prosperity to America and elevated the standard of living. The social norms of old were openly challenged. Gender roles began to change, and racial minorities found niches in American society and culture. On the other hand, prohibitionists attempted to curtail the social scenes of the 20s. Elements of archaic white supremacy found new footholds in the decade, and the Bible Belt also dug in its heels. The 1920s was certainly a time of progress, but it serves as a reminder that no progress comes uninhibited. Next time, we'll see the roaring 20s come crashing down as we look inside the Great Depression. See you then.